While I was bleeding on the delivery table. While I was bleeding on the delivery table, screaming for help, my husband sat down and opened his newspaper. "It's normal. Women always make a fuss," he told the doctor, who arrived late. For 18 hours, I was between life and death, while the man who vowed to love me simply watched me fade away. Hello, my dear viewers. What a blessing to speak with you today. I'm Eleanor Jane Miller, 73 years old, born in a small town called Oak Ridge in rural Kentucky, but now I live here in Maplewood, Missouri. I'm recording this video from my porch, where I have all my lovely plants. Can you see these beautiful ferns behind me? I've been growing them for over 15 years. These days, I spend my time tending to my garden and doing my embroidery. I started embroidering when I was just a young girl, but it wasn't until after 60 that I turned it into a small income. I make tablecloths, napkins, and even baby clothes with my embroidery. People in town place orders, especially for baby showers. It's work that calms my soul, you know? Each little stitch feels like I'm sewing together pieces of my own story. My daughter Lucille helped me set up this channel. She said, "Mom, your stories need to be told." At first I was embarrassed. Imagine a woman my age talking to this big wide internet. But now I see how much it can help others. And you, my dear viewers watching now, tell me in the comments, which town are you watching from? And what time of day did you find this video? Early morning with your coffee, after lunch, or late at night after dinner? I always read all the comments, and I'm so happy to know where you're from and when you take time out of your day to listen to this grandma's stories. Tell me, okay? Let's create a circle of kindness. If you like the video, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Just hit that red button down below. My 12-year-old granddaughter Emily taught me that it's important to say this. And you can hit the bell too, so you receive a notification when I post a new video. Today, I want to talk with you about a difficult subject, but one that needs to be discussed. About how even in moments that should be the most beautiful in a woman's life, like the birth of a child, we can suffer abuse from those who should protect us. Abuse doesn't always come from a slap or a shout. Sometimes it comes from silence, from indifference, from abandonment when we need help the most. I remember like it was yesterday the birth of my first child, Thomas. It was in 1972. I was only 20 years old, and that day changed my life forever. Not just because I became a mother, but because it was when I realized what kind of man I had by my side. I was born in a simple wooden house with a dirt floor in Oak Ridge, Kentucky. My father, Ernest Miller, worked the land, growing corn, beans, and potatoes on a plot that wasn't ours, but that his boss let him use in exchange for work. He was a good man, my father, a man of few words but hard work. My mother, Margaret, was a seamstress who made clothes for the wealthier families in the area and also mended our own. We were 6 siblings, me, the oldest, then came Robert, Elizabeth, Oliver, Dorothy, and the youngest, James. Our house was small but well kept. It had 2 rooms, one for my parents and another where the 6 of us children squeezed onto 2 large mats spread on the floor. The kitchen had a wood stove that my mother lit early in the morning while it was still dark to make coffee and cornbread that we ate every morning before heading out to work. The backyard was large, with many fruit trees, apple trees, peach trees, cherry trees, and a pen where we raised 2 pigs that were our savings for hard times. As a girl, I would wake before sunrise. I helped my mother light the stove, fetched water from the well that was about a 15-minute walk from the house. I carried the bucket on my head, like all the women in the area did. After breakfast, I'd go to school, which was almost an hour's walk away. It was a small rural school with just 1 room where children of all ages studied. The teacher, Miss Florence, was a strict woman, but she taught me to read and write with great dedication. After school, I'd return home to help with chores. I washed clothes in the creek with my mother, looked after my younger siblings, helped make dinner. On Sundays, we'd go to the little Baptist church, the patron saint of our community. It was a special day because we wore our best clothes, and after the service, families would gather in the churchyard to talk while the children could play. Oh, the games of my childhood. I played Ring Around the Rosie with the other girls, singing London Bridge and Mary Mac. The boys played with homemade balls or flew kites. Sometimes, all together, we'd play tag and hide and seek until the sun went down. During the 4th of July, which is a very important celebration in Kentucky, we'd have a bonfire and eat roasted corn, homemade apple pie, and cornbread. We'd dance square dances and watch fireworks, a tradition they said brought good luck. My best friend was Teresa, daughter of Mr. Arnold, the store owner. We two were inseparable. We went to school together, played together, dreamed together about the future. "When I grow up, I'll be a teacher," she'd say. "And I'll be a seamstress like my mother," I'd answer. Our life was simple, but we didn't go without. Of course, there were times of drought, when the beans ran out early and water was scarce. In those moments, my father needed to go work farther away, sometimes staying away for weeks at farms in other counties. My mother would make do by sewing more and selling molasses cookies that my sisters and I helped make. It was during one of these droughts, when I was 12 years old, that the bigger difficulties started for our family. It was 1964, I remember well, because it was the year of what they called the Civil Rights Movement. But in rural Kentucky, we barely knew what was happening in the rest of the country. "The drought that year was terrible, the worst in decades," said the elders. "The wells dried up, the crops died, even the deepest springs began to give brackish water." My father, desperate because he couldn't find more work in the region, decided to try his luck in Louisville. He stayed away for almost a year, sending a little money when he could. My mother, who was very religious, started doing daily prayers to Saint Joseph, the patron saint of workers. We children felt the change in the atmosphere of the house. It wasn't just the scorching heat and the lack of water. It was the worry etched on my mother's face, the heavy silence when yet another neighbor announced they were leaving for the Midwest. It was during this time that I noticed the first big change in my life. I had to leave school to help more at home. Miss Florence came personally to talk to my mother. "Mrs. Miller, Eleanor is a brilliant student. Don't take her out of school." But there was no way around it. Everyone had to do their part for the family to survive. My mother began teaching me to sew. "It's a trade, daughter. With it, you'll never go hungry," she'd say as she showed me how to make the basic stitches. I learned quickly and soon was helping with the simplest mending. That's when I also started to get interested in embroidery, seeing the delicate pieces that some richer clients brought for my mother to repair. When my father returned from Louisville, I hardly recognized him. He was thinner, with a sunburned face and a tired expression I'd never seen before. But he brought news that would change our fate. He had secured a steady job at a textile factory in St. Louis, and the whole family would move there. I remember the mix of fear and excitement I felt upon learning we would leave Oak Ridge. On one hand, I was sad to part from Teresa and the places I knew. On the other, I dreamed of the big city, of returning to school, of a life less harsh than that of rural Kentucky. It was a long and tiring journey in an overcrowded bus, crossing dirt roads that seemed more like rivers during the rainy season, which had finally arrived. We slept in bus stations, ate egg sandwiches that my mother had prepared for the journey, drank water from bottles that got warm with the heat of the day. We arrived in St. Louis in early 1965. I had just turned 13 and was about to enter a very different phase of my life. The big city, with its buildings, buses, and crowds, scared and fascinated me at the same time. I didn't know yet, but that change would be just the beginning of many others that fate had in store for me. Life in St. Louis was a shock for a girl raised in rural Kentucky. The first months were difficult. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment in the back of a lot in the Carondelet neighborhood, all of us crammed into that small space. My father would leave before dawn to work at the factory and only return in the evening, always exhausted. My mother soon found some regular clients for sewing, and I helped her as best I could. I went back to school, at a public school near home. I remember being ashamed of my strong Kentucky accent. The other girls sometimes laughed at my way of saying y'all and ain't. But I soon made some friends, especially Ginny, a girl who was also from elsewhere, from rural Indiana. Little by little, we adapted. My father was promoted at the factory. We managed to rent a larger house in another neighborhood. I studied in the morning and in the afternoon helped my mother with sewing or looked after my younger siblings. On weekends, we went to church at St. Mary's, and sometimes, as a special outing, we'd walk to the city center to see the hustle and bustle, have an ice cream, look at the shop windows. The years passed. I finished what they called elementary school, and then junior high. My dream was to continue studying, maybe even go to college, but when I turned 17, in 1969, my father fell ill. It was something in his lungs. The doctors said it was because of the fabric dust he breathed every day at the factory. He had to stop working, and the family's financial situation became difficult again. That's when I decided to look for a job. I got a position as a sales clerk at a fabric store in downtown St. Louis, Fine Fabrics. The owner, Mr. Wilson, hired me because I understood fabrics and also knew how to sew, so I could advise customers well. It was at the store that I met Richard. He was a sales representative for a button and thread factory from Chicago, came once a month to sell to Mr. Wilson. He was a handsome man, with an imposing bearing, always well-dressed, with his impeccable suits and well-combed hair. He was 28, 11 years older than me, and seemed so sophisticated, so knowledgeable about the world. The first time we talked, he asked me about a fabric that was in the window display. "Did you choose this color combination, miss? You have very good taste," he said with a smile that made me blush. I explained that yes, I had helped set up the window display. After that, every time he came to the store, he sought to talk to me. In the 3rd month, he invited me for coffee after my shift. I was nervous. I had never gone out alone with a man before. But I accepted. We went to a fancy bakery downtown where he ordered coffee and a slice of strawberry pie for each of us. He told me he was from Springfield, but had moved to St. Louis for work, that he traveled a lot through the Midwest, that he earned well and was building a house in Springfield, where he intended to return someday. "And your family?" I asked. He explained that his parents had already passed away, that he had only one married sister who lived in Indianapolis. I was impressed by his independence, his life seemingly without ties or difficulties. It was so different from my reality, taking care of siblings, helping parents, counting every penny. On subsequent visits, we always went out for coffee or sometimes dinner. He took me to places I could never afford with my salesgirl salary. He treated me like a lady, pulled out my chair for me to sit, wouldn't let me pay for anything. For a simple country girl like me, it seemed like a fairy tale. When I told my mother about Richard, she was concerned. "This young man is much older, daughter, and he travels so much. Are you sure it's serious?" But my father, already weakened by illness, viewed it favorably. "An established man, with good work, that's what you need, Eleanor." 6 months after we met, Richard officially asked me to be his girlfriend, talking to my father, as was the custom. He started coming to our house on the Sundays he was in St. Louis, had lunch with us, brought gifts, a radio for my father to listen to the news, nice fabrics for my mother, candy for my siblings. At first, everything seemed perfect. Richard was attentive, wrote me letters when he was traveling, brought small gifts from the cities he visited. He even gave me a promise ring, a simple but beautiful piece of jewelry that I wore with pride. My colleagues at the store sighed with envy. "How lucky you are, Eleanor, to find such a good man." But after a few months, I began to notice small changes. Richard had strong opinions about everything: the clothes I should wear, how I should style my hair, even who my friends should be. At first, I interpreted this as concern, as care. He'd say, "A committed young lady shouldn't wear that kind of dress," or, "Why do you need to go out with Ginny? She's not good company for you." I remember well the first time he showed his more difficult temperament. It was on a Sunday. We were walking in Forest Park, and we ran into an old schoolmate of mine, Jerry. I greeted him cheerfully. We talked for a few minutes about old times. When Jerry left, Richard squeezed my arm hard. "Who was that? Why were you so happy talking to him?" I explained that he was just a schoolmate, but he didn't believe me. I saw the way you looked at him. Are you making a fool of me? I was shocked by the accusation, by the anger in his voice. I cried, swore there was nothing, and finally he calmed down, even apologized. It's just that I love you too much, Eleanor. I'm afraid of losing you. I accepted the apology, of course. After all, wasn't it a sign of love for him to be jealous? Wasn't that how men in love behaved? At least that's what I thought in my naivety as a country girl, who only knew relationships from the soap operas I secretly read, or the radio dramas I'd listened to while sewing. Things got worse when my father passed away in March of 1970. It was a terrible blow for the whole family. He was only 45 years old, but the lung disease consumed him quickly. Richard supported me during the funeral and the first days of mourning, but soon after came with a proposal. You're having difficulties now, without your father's salary. Why don't we get married soon? I can take care of you and help your family. The proposal seemed generous, and my mother, concerned about the future, encouraged me to accept. He's a good man, daughter, and wants to give you security. In these times, you don't easily find that. 3 months after my father's passing, we were married. It was a simple ceremony, in the same church we attended. Me in a simple white dress my mother made, him in his best suit. The first surprise came right after the wedding. Richard announced that I should leave my job at the store. My wife doesn't need to work. What kind of husband would I be if I couldn't support my wife? I tried to argue that I liked my job, that the extra money would help, but he was inflexible. It's already decided, Eleanor. The second surprise was even more impactful. We would move to Springfield, where he had his house. But what about my family? I asked anxiously. They stay in St. Louis. You now have your own family, which is me, he replied dryly. I knew I had no choice. After all, he was my husband. He had the right to decide where we would live. With a heavy heart, I said goodbye to my mother and siblings, promising to visit them whenever possible. What I didn't know was that Richard would do everything to ensure these visits were rare. Our house in Springfield was really beautiful, much better than any place I had lived before. It had 3 bedrooms, a spacious living room, a well-equipped kitchen, even a backyard with some fruit trees that reminded me a little of Oak Ridge. But I soon felt like a bird in a golden cage. Richard spent most of his time traveling, leaving me alone for weeks. When he returned, he wanted to find everything impeccable, meals prepared exactly as he liked, the house in absolute order. If something wasn't the way he expected, he would easily get irritated. What do you stay at home all day for, if you can't even do this right? In the first months of marriage, I also discovered another side of him I didn't know. Richard drank. He wasn't an alcoholic. He didn't drink every day. But when he did, he transformed. He became verbally aggressive, accused me of absurd things, like looking at other men or not fulfilling my wifely duties. It was on one of those nights, after returning from a long trip, that he drank more than usual and forced me to have relations even though I didn't want to. I'm your husband. I have my rights, he said as he tore my nightgown. I cried all night, feeling dirty and used. In the morning, he didn't remember anything or pretended not to remember. A few weeks later, I realized I was pregnant. I had mixed feelings, joy at having a child, fear of how Richard would react, apprehension about how it would be to raise a child so far from my family, practically alone most of the time. When I told Richard, his reaction was strange. He showed neither joy nor sadness, just said, "Then we'd better start saving money." At first, I thought it was financial concern, but I soon understood it wasn't just that. It was as if the pregnancy was merely an inconvenience, something that would interfere with his comfortable life. His trips continued normally. The pregnancy didn't change his routine at all. Meanwhile, I faced morning sickness alone, back pain, fatigue. I didn't have a mother or a friend nearby to advise me, to hold my hand in difficult moments. I managed to convince Richard to let me visit my family when I was 5 months along. It was a relief to be with my mother, who gave me advice about the pregnancy, prepared home remedies for my pains, sewed baby clothes. My siblings were excited about the idea of being uncles and aunts. Those 10 days were like an oasis in the desert of my loneliness. I returned to Springfield more confident, thinking that perhaps the baby's birth would soften Richard's heart, that perhaps we would become a real family. I started preparing the nursery, knitting booties, dreaming of a better future. But as my belly grew, Richard seemed more and more distant. He rarely touched me, never caressed my belly or talked to the baby as I saw other fathers do. When I tried to involve him, saying things like, "Did you feel that kick? I think he's going to be a football player," he would just respond with an uninterested, and go back to reading his newspaper. In one of the rare medical consultations I had, which Richard accompanied because he was in Springfield, Dr. Harold, an elderly gentleman and the only doctor in the small town, commented that the baby seemed large and that the delivery could be complicated. "It might be better to go to St. Louis when it's close to the date to have the baby in a larger hospital," he suggested. I was frightened and looked at Richard, expecting support, but he just shrugged. "Doctor, my wife is from the country, strong. Women like her have children in the middle of fields and keep working. We don't need this exaggeration." I left the office feeling humiliated and even more apprehensive. That night, while Richard slept, I cried silently. I was afraid of the delivery, afraid of being alone, afraid of what would happen to me and my baby. I thought about fleeing to my mother's house in St. Louis, but I had no money of my own. Richard controlled every penny that came into the house. The next day, I tried once more to talk about going to St. Louis for the birth. At least we would be near my mother, who could help me with the baby in the first weeks, I argued. His response was harsh. "Your mother has her own children to take care of, and I already said we're not going to spend money on a hotel in St. Louis when we have a perfectly good house here." I realized then that I was alone on this journey. The man who had promised to protect and care for me was more concerned with money and convenience than with my well-being or our sons. For the first time, I wondered what kind of father Richard would be, and the thought filled me with sadness. As the end of the pregnancy approached, my anxiety increased. I had frequent nightmares where I was giving birth alone, screaming for help, while Richard simply read his newspaper in the living room. I would wake up sweating, with my heart racing, only to find the other side of the bed empty. He was away on yet another of his trips. What I didn't know was that my nightmares were premonitions of what was to come. The worst day of my life was approaching, and I would be completely unprepared for what would happen when the first contractions began on a rainy night in August of 1972. It was the night of August 12th, 1972, a date that was seared into my soul as if written with a hot iron. The rain was falling heavily in Springfield, making a deafening noise on the roof of our house. Richard had returned from a trip that afternoon, tired and ill-tempered as always. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner with my enormous 9-month belly when I felt the first contraction. It was like a knife in my back that spread to my belly. I was breathless, supporting myself on the sink so as not to fall. When I managed to recover, I went to the living room where Richard was reading the newspaper. "Richard, I think the baby is coming." I felt a very strong contraction. He lowered the newspaper slowly, looked me up and down with an expression of inconvenience, as if I had broken some rule. "Are you sure? Isn't it just indigestion? You ate that leftover bean soup from yesterday's lunch?" "I'm sure," I replied, feeling another contraction begin. "We need to go to the hospital." He methodically folded the newspaper, placed it on the table, and sighed. "It's raining a lot, Eleanor. The roads must be a muddy mess, and it's already late, almost 9 o'clock. Why don't these babies ever come at convenient times?" At that moment, an even stronger contraction hit me. I moaned in pain, bending forward. Richard finally stood up, but not to help me. He went to the window, pulled back the curtain, and looked at the torrential rain. As I said, it's a deluge. "The hospital is on the other side of town. Let's wait for the rain to diminish." "We can't wait," I shouted, feeling panic grow. "Dr. Harold said the baby is large, that there could be complications. We need to go now." Richard turned to me with that cold look I already knew well, the same look he had when I mentioned visiting my family or when I talked about finding a job in Springfield. "Don't be dramatic, Eleanor. Women have been giving birth for thousands of years. Your own mother had 6 children, didn't she? And I bet she didn't make all this fuss." Another contraction hit me, more intense, making me scream in pain. When it passed, I said through clenched teeth, "I'm going to call our neighbor, Mrs. Durbin. Ask her to call Dr. Harold to come here." "You're not going to bother the neighbors at this hour," Richard ordered, his voice rising. "Go to the bedroom, lie down. I'll make a tea, and soon you'll calm down." I obeyed, not because I believed a tea would solve anything, but because I had no strength to argue. I dragged myself to the bedroom, each step an agony. The contractions were becoming more frequent and intense. I lay on the bed, feeling the wet mattress beneath me. My water had broken. When Richard entered with the cup of tea and saw the situation, his face contorted in an expression of disgust. "Look what you did to our bed. These sheets are new." I couldn't respond. The pain was so intense that I saw black spots dancing in front of my eyes. I felt immense pressure, as if something was tearing my body in half. "Richard," I whispered when I could speak, "the baby is coming. Please call someone. Call Dr. Harold, please." He snorted in irritation, but left the room. I heard him in the living room, messing with something. Maybe he was getting an umbrella to go seek help. Maybe he was calling the doctor. I allowed myself a moment of hope. But when he returned, he brought only an old sheet. "I'm going to put this under you. Lift up a bit." Without gentleness, he adjusted the sheet beneath me. Then, to my horror, he picked up the newspaper he had been reading before and sat in the chair beside the bed. "What are you doing?" I asked incredulously. "Waiting. What else can I do? If the baby is really coming, it will be born anyway, right? It doesn't need me for that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man who had vowed to love and protect me was sitting comfortably, reading about sports results while I suffered the most terrible pain of my life. The following hours were a blur of pain and despair. The contractions came one after another without giving time to breathe. I screamed, begged for help, prayed aloud. Richard occasionally lowered the newspaper to look at me with an expression of boredom mixed with irritation. "Can't you make less noise? The neighbors will think I'm killing you." At some point in the early morning, I felt a change. The pressure increased tremendously, and I had an uncontrollable urge to push. "The baby is coming," I screamed. Richard finally put the newspaper aside and approached the bed. He looked between my legs, and his face paled. "I can see the head," he said, sounding frightened for the first time. "Help me," I begged. He took 2 steps back, shaking his head. "I don't know what to do. I've never done this before." "Then go get help. Now!" I screamed, with the last bit of strength I had. He hesitated, looking at the door, at me, at the rain outside. "It's still raining a lot." At that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't just physical, although I felt as if my body was being split in half. It was something deeper, a clear understanding that I was completely alone at the most vulnerable moment of my life. The man who should have been my protector, my companion, was more concerned with the rain that could wet his suit than with the possibility of his wife and child dying before his eyes. With a scream that seemed to come from the depths of my soul, I pushed with all my strength. I felt a liquid fire between my legs, a pain so intense that I thought I would die. Then, a momentary relief when the baby's head came out. "Pull him!" I screamed to Richard. "You need to carefully pull the baby." Reluctantly, he approached and with an expression of disgust helped pull the baby while I continued pushing. With one last desperate effort, I felt the rest of the little body slip out of me, accompanied by a frightening amount of blood. The room was silent for a moment, broken only by the sound of the rain. Then, a weak cry. then stronger. My son was alive. I extended my arms, wanting to hold him, but I was so weak that I could barely lift my head. Richard awkwardly held the baby, looking at the blood-covered child as if he were an alien. "It's a boy," he finally said, placing him on my chest without care. I embraced my son, crying with relief and love, despite the unbearable pain I still felt. He was perfect, with dark hair and chubby cheeks, even covered in blood and other things I don't even want to mention. "He's beautiful," I whispered, kissing his little head. "We'll call him Thomas," as we agreed. Richard didn't respond. He was staring fixedly at the bed, at the space between my legs. I followed his gaze and saw with horror that the bleeding hadn't stopped. In fact, it seemed to be getting worse, quickly soaking the old sheet he had placed under me. "Richard," I called, my voice weak. "Something's wrong. I'm bleeding a lot." He remained standing, paralyzed, as if he couldn't process what was happening. "Richard!" I shouted with more strength. "Go get the doctor. Now, I'm losing a lot of blood." That seemed to snap him out of his trance. He nodded quickly and ran out of the room. I heard the front door slam. I stayed there, holding my newborn son, feeling life drain from me along with the blood that wouldn't stop flowing. I was getting weaker by the minute, my vision darkening at the edges. I thought of my mother, my siblings, the life I would never have with my son. "God," I prayed aloud, "don't take me yet. My son needs me." I don't know how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? At some point, I heard voices, hurried footsteps. Dr. Harold entered the room, followed by Richard and Mrs. Durbin, a known midwife in town. "My God in heaven!" exclaimed the doctor upon seeing the amount of blood. He quickly took the baby from my arms and handed him to Mrs. Durbin, who wrapped him in a clean blanket she had brought. "The placenta didn't come out," said Dr. Harold, examining me quickly. "And there's a large tear. You're losing too much blood. We need to take you to the hospital immediately." "But the rain," Richard began. The doctor interrupted him with a furious look. "Mr. Phillips, your wife is dying. If we don't take her to the hospital now, she won't make it through this morning." I was carried to the doctor's car, wrapped in bloodied blankets. Mrs. Durbin stayed with the baby, promising to care for him until I returned, if I returned. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was Richard's face, a mixture of concern and irritation, as if that whole situation was a great inconvenience for him. I woke up 3 days later in the Springfield hospital. I had received blood transfusions and undergone emergency surgery to stop the bleeding and repair the internal damage. Dr. Harold explained that I had suffered a severe hemorrhage due to retention of the placenta and extensive lacerations during delivery. "It was a close call, Mrs. Phillips. Another half hour, and we wouldn't have been able to save you." I asked about my son and was told he was fine, still under the care of Mrs. Durbin. Richard appeared briefly, uncomfortable in the hospital environment, complaining about the costs of the treatment. He didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't show relief that I was alive. His main concern was when I could return home to take care of the boy and the house. When I finally returned home, a week later, I was too weak to care for the baby alone. My mother-in-law, Mrs. Phillips, whom I didn't even know existed until then, came from Indianapolis to help. She was a harsh, critical woman who made it clear at every moment that I had failed by not being able to give birth normally. In my day, a woman had a child, and the next day was already back in the fields working, she would say, as I struggled to get out of bed, the stitches from the surgery still painful. Richard returned to his travels as soon as his mother arrived, clearly relieved not to have to deal with a crying baby and a convalescent wife. Before leaving, he came to the bedroom where I was nursing Thomas. He stopped at the door, without entering, and said coldly, "Next time, we're going to St. Louis well before. This delivery cost us a fortune." I couldn't respond. Only after he left did I let the tears fall freely as I looked at my son's little face. "Next time," he said, as if there would be a next time, as if I could even think about going through that again. The doctors had been clear. My uterus had been severely damaged. I was lucky not to need it removed, but more children would be extremely risky. I didn't tell Richard this before he traveled. In fact, I didn't tell anyone except my mother, in a desperate letter I managed to send in secret. During the following weeks, as I slowly recovered under the critical eye of my mother-in-law, I relived that terrible night thousands of times in my mind. Richard's contempt, his newspaper, his reluctance to seek help, his concern with the stained sheets instead of with my life. The trauma of the birth mixed with the trauma of finally and completely realizing the kind of man I had married. Philip stayed with us for a month. In the days before her departure, I managed to convince her to help me write to my mother, asking her to come visit. Using the excuse that a grandmother should meet her grandson, I obtained Richard's reluctant permission for my mother to spend 2 weeks with us. When my mother arrived, I was shocked by her reaction upon seeing me. She covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes full of tears. "My daughter, what happened to you? Your skin and bones." Only then did I realize how much I had lost weight, how sick I looked. My hair, once thick and shiny, was dull and brittle. My skin, once rosy, was yellowish and lifeless. I looked like an old woman, not a young woman of 20. In the comfort of my mother's arms, I could finally really cry. I told her everything: the terrible birth, Richard's negligence, his cruel behavior before and after. I talked about the loneliness, about the fear, about how I felt trapped in a life I had never chosen. My mother listened to everything in silence, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. When I finished, she held my hands in hers and said words I never forgot. "Daughter, you almost died giving birth, but now you're dying little by little, every day, in this marriage. A man who abandons you at the time of childbirth is capable of abandoning you in any situation." That night, lying in bed beside the crib where Thomas slept, I thought about my mother's words. She was right. I was slowly dying, my soul fading a little more each day under the weight of Richard's indifference and cruelty. And what would become of my son, growing up with a father like that? What example would he have? What kind of man would he become? The following weeks were of deep reflection and silent planning. When Richard was home, I maintained the facade of a submissive wife and dedicated mother. When he traveled, I talked at length with my mother about the future, about possibilities, about courage. What I didn't know was that that terrible night in August wouldn't be the last time I would find myself on the brink of death because of Richard. The worst was yet to come, and I would need all my strength and the unexpected help of a stranger to survive. The months that followed Thomas's birth were a mix of joy and despair. Joy for the small moments with my son, his first smile, the warmth of his little body against mine during nursing, the feeling of his tiny fingers gripping my finger. Despair for the reality of my marriage, which only got worse each day. Richard returned from a particularly long trip in February 1973 when Thomas was 6 months old. He found the house impeccable, dinner ready, the baby clean and fed. But none of that mattered. He was irritated because a business deal hadn't worked out, and as always, I was his emotional punching bag. "What did you do all day?" he asked, while picking at the food I had prepared with such care. "Just sit around playing with the boy? The porch paint is peeling." "Why didn't you take advantage and paint it?" I tried to explain that taking care of a small baby alone took all my time, that I still hadn't fully recovered my strength after the difficult birth. But he didn't listen. He never listened. That night, after putting Thomas to sleep, Richard demanded his husband's rights. Since the birth, we had had relations few times, always painful for me, always without any affection or consideration. That night, however, he had drunk more than usual. When I tried to explain that I still felt pain, that the doctor had recommended caution, he became furious. "It's been 6 months. How long do you expect me to wait? A man has needs, Eleanor." What followed was brutal. For the first time, besides emotional violence and negligence, Richard used physical force. He held my wrists so hard that he left purple marks, ignored my pleas to stop, my cries of pain. When he finished, he turned to the side and slept as if nothing had happened, while I silently cried, feeling violated and broken inside. The next morning, he acted normally, as if the previous night hadn't existed. Before leaving for another trip, he left some money on the table. "For household expenses," he said, without looking me in the eyes. And then he was gone, for another 2 weeks. As soon as Richard's car left the street, I collapsed on the kitchen floor, sobbing. The physical pain was intense. I felt torn inside again, but the emotional pain was unbearable. Where was that well-dressed young man who treated me like a lady, who pulled out my chair for me to sit? Had it all been an illusion, or had he transformed after the wedding? It didn't matter. The man I was married to was a monster, and I needed to protect my son and myself. Thomas began to cry in his crib, bringing me back to reality. I dried my tears, took a deep breath, and went to care for my baby. As I nursed him, looking at his innocent little face, I made a decision. I needed to leave that marriage, that house, that town. But how? I had no money of my own, had nowhere to go besides my mother's house, which was already cramped with my siblings. That afternoon, still in pain and emotionally exhausted, I went to the small neighborhood store to buy milk and bread. Mrs. Quinn, the owner, a lady in her 60s, looked at me strangely when I entered. "Is everything all right with you, Mrs. Phillips?" she asked with genuine concern. I tried to smile, but my lips trembled. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Quinn." She looked at the baby in my arms, then at the bruises on my wrists that I had tried to hide with long sleeves, but that appeared when I extended my arm to get the bread. "Your husband traveled again?" she asked casually, but her look said she knew more than she let on. "Yes, he left again today. He'll be gone for 2 weeks." She nodded slowly, then lowered her voice, even though there was no one else in the small store. "Mrs. Phillips, I know it's not my business, but my daughter went through something similar. Her husband, well, he wasn't a good man." She paused as if choosing her words. "If you need to talk or anything else, my house is behind the store. You can come any time." I was speechless, feeling the tears wanting to return. I just thanked her and left quickly, before I broke down in front of her. In the following days, I reflected a lot on Mrs. Quinn's offer. Was she really trustworthy? And even if she was, what could she do to help me? Richard was a respected man in town, a successful businessman. I was just the wife from the country who hardly left the house, whom almost no one knew. The following week, I gathered my courage and returned to the store when it was almost closing, knowing there would be fewer customers. Mrs. Quinn welcomed me with a gentle smile and invited me for coffee in the back, where her house was. There, in the cozy little kitchen, with Thomas sleeping peacefully in my arms, I finally opened up. I told her about the terrible birth, about the negligence, about the recent violence. I told her about the isolation, about the financial control, about the constant fear. Mrs. Quinn listened to everything in silence, occasionally nodding. When I finished, she held my free hand firmly. My daughter Nancy went through something similar. Her husband almost beat her to death. One day, she fled with my 2 grandchildren. Today she lives in Des Moines, works as a nurse, rebuilt her life. It's possible to get out of this situation, Mrs. Phillips. Difficult, but possible. "But how?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I don't have money of my own. He controls everything, and I'm afraid of what he would do if I tried to leave, if I tried to take Thomas." Mrs. Quinn squeezed my hand harder. "We're going to think of a plan. You're not alone now." During the 2 weeks that Richard was away, I visited Mrs. Quinn almost daily. Together, we elaborated a plan. She introduced me to her son, Oliver, a young man in his early 20s who was a truck driver and regularly drove the Springfield-St. Louis-Kansas City route. Oliver can take you and the boy to St. Louis, to your mother's house, explained Mrs. Quinn. The problem is the money to maintain yourself there and the boy's documentation. She was right. Richard kept all the important documents, my marriage certificate, Thomas's birth certificate, even my personal documents, in a locked drawer in his office. And as for money, he only left me enough for basic expenses during his trips. One night, lying in bed while Thomas slept, I had an idea. The safe. Richard had a small safe built into the wall of his office, behind a picture. I had never seen the contents, but once I surprised him opening it. He was counting money, a lot of money. If I could open that safe, maybe I would find not only enough money to start over, but also the documents we needed. The problem was the combination. How to discover it. The next morning, I told my idea to Mrs. Quinn. She was thoughtful for a moment. Men like Mr. Phillips usually use important dates as passwords. Birthday, wedding date, things like that. I tried everything. Richard's birth date, our wedding date, even Thomas's birth date. Nothing worked. The safe remained locked, guarding its secrets. When Richard returned from his trip, I returned to my routine of submissive and silent wife. I served his meals, took care of the house, avoided provoking him. At night, when he demanded his rights, I bit my lip not to cry from pain and humiliation. It's just for now, I told myself, just until I find a way out. One night, about 3 days after his return, Richard was particularly satisfied. He had closed an important deal, was in a good mood. He drank more than usual, but didn't get aggressive as normally happened. Instead, he became talkative, almost nostalgic. "Do you know what day it is today?" he asked, as he sipped his cognac. "Tuesday?" I replied, confused. He laughed. "No, silly. It's March 14th. It's been 3 years today since my father died. Old Arthur. He was a difficult man, but he taught me everything I know about business." My heart raced. Arthur. March 14th. Could it be possible? The next morning, as soon as Richard left to take care of business in town, I ran to the office. With trembling hands, I removed the picture from the wall and exposed the small safe. I turned the dial, entering 03-1470, March 14th, 1970, the date of his father's death. With a soft click, the safe opened. Inside, I found exactly what I had hoped for: several bills, carefully organized, and a folder with documents. Among them, my personal documents, Thomas's birth certificate, our marriage certificate. I took enough to survive a few months and all the important documents. I closed the safe, replaced the picture, and returned to the kitchen, hiding everything in an empty sugar can in the cupboard. That afternoon, when I returned to Mrs. Quinn's store, my face must have been radiant despite the fear, because she smiled as soon as she saw me. "Did you manage?" she asked in a low voice. I nodded, hardly believing it had worked. "I got the documents and some money. When can we go?" "Oliver leaves for St. Louis the day after tomorrow, at dawn. Be ready at 4 in the morning. He'll pass in front of your house and give 2 short honks. 2 days. In 2 days I could leave that hell behind, take my son to a safe place, start a new life." I felt a mix of euphoria and terror. What if Richard found out? What if he found us? What if— "Don't think about that now, Mrs. Quinn interrupted my thoughts, as if she could read them. "Just focus on being ready at the right time. The rest we'll solve later." On the night before the planned escape, Richard arrived home earlier than usual. He was tense, irritated. He threw his briefcase on the table with force. "Where's the money?" he asked without preamble. I froze inside. "What money?" "Don't play dumb, Eleanor. The money from the safe. A considerable amount is missing." My stomach sank. How could he have discovered so quickly? Did he open the safe every day? Had he counted the money before leaving that morning? I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. "I didn't even know there was a safe." His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you calling me a liar?" He took a step in my direction. or a fool. Another step. Do you think I haven't noticed how different you've been acting these last days? How you spend hours at that nosy old woman's store? My heart raced. He knew. Somehow, he knew or suspected my plans. Maybe he had even followed me, heard my conversations with Mrs. Quinn. Richard, I just go to the store to shop, and I don't know anything about any money, I swear. My voice came out thin, trembling with fear. He advanced another step, now so close that I could smell his cigarette and cognac breath. I'm going to find out what you're plotting, Eleanor. And when I do. He left the phrase hanging in the air, the threat clear in his eyes. At that moment, Thomas, who was sleeping in the next room, began to cry. I was never so grateful for my son's crying. Richard backed away, still staring at me. Go take care of the boy. We'll continue this conversation later. I ran to the room, taking Thomas in my arms, cradling him against my chest that rose and fell with rapid breathing. Calm down, my little angel, I whispered, both to him and to myself. Everything will be all right. But I knew it wouldn't be. Not if we stayed there. Richard was suspicious, was furious, and a furious Richard was dangerous, unpredictable. We couldn't wait until dawn, until Oliver's truck. We needed to leave that very night. When Richard finally fell asleep, after more cognac and more accusations, I began to act. With as much silence as possible, I gathered some clothes of mine and Thomas's in an improvised bundle. I took the documents and money hidden in the sugar can. I put on a coat, as March nights were cool in Springfield. I wrapped Thomas in a warm blanket. Then, holding my breath, I opened the back door of the house and went out into the night. Mrs. Quinn's house was about a 15-minute walk away. I walked hurriedly, always looking back, fearing to see Richard's figure following me. Thomas, miraculously, remained quiet, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. When I arrived at the store, already closed at that hour, I knocked lightly on the back door. After some anxious moments, the door opened, revealing Mrs. Quinn in her nightgown, her gray hair loose over her shoulders. My God in heaven, what happened? She asked, pulling me inside. Through tears, I explained the situation. Richard had discovered about the money, was suspicious, furious. We couldn't wait until dawn. Mrs. Quinn didn't hesitate. I'll wake Oliver. He can leave right now. Half an hour later, I was sitting in the cabin of Oliver's truck, with Thomas sleeping in my lap. The young man, still sleepy but determined, started the engine. Hold on tight, Mrs. Phillips, he said. The road isn't the best, especially at night. When the truck began to move, I looked back one last time. I saw the silhouette of Mrs. Quinn at the door of her house, waving goodbye. Further ahead, on the horizon, I could see the outline of the house where I had lived for almost 3 years, the house that had been my prison. As the truck gained speed on the dark road, I understood that I was really leaving everything behind. The failed marriage, the abuse, the constant fear. I was fleeing in the middle of the night with little more than the clothes on my back and my son in my arms. I had no idea what the future held, if Richard would find us, if I would manage to survive on my own. I only knew one thing. After what I lived through on that night of childbirth, abandoned when I needed it most, and after everything that came after, any future would be better than staying there. Hugging Thomas tighter against my chest, I made a silent promise. Never again will someone mistreat us, my son. Never again will we be at the mercy of someone who doesn't care about us. Never again. The truck continued on the dark road, taking us away from Springfield, away from Richard, to an uncertain but, I hoped, better future. The full moon illuminated the path ahead, like a beacon of hope on the darkest night of my life. The journey from Springfield to St. Louis that night seemed endless. Oliver's truck bounced on the potholed road, and I held Thomas firmly against my chest, fearing that each distant headlight was Richard pursuing us. Oliver spoke little, focused on driving, but occasionally offered words of encouragement. You did the right thing, Mrs. Phillips. My sister Nancy says leaving was the most difficult and most important decision of her life. We arrived in St. Louis in the early morning, when the first rays of sun began to color the sky. Oliver dropped me off 2 blocks from my mother's house, as agreed. Better not to stop the truck directly at the door, he explained. If your husband comes looking, no one will be able to say they saw a truck. I thanked Oliver with tears in my eyes. I'll never forget what you and your mother did for me. God bless you. He smiled shyly. No need to thank me. Mom always says that helping someone to freedom is the most important work one can do in this life. With Thomas in my arms and my small bundle of belongings, I walked the 2 blocks to my mother's house. It was a simple house in the Tower Grove neighborhood, which she had rented since our move to St. Louis. I stopped in front of the iron gate, gathering courage. What would I say? How would I explain my sudden arrival in the middle of the early morning, with a baby and almost no luggage? Before I could decide, the door of the house opened. My mother appeared on the threshold, still in her nightgown, as if she had sensed my presence. Our eyes met through the gate, and in an instant, she ran to open it. Eleanor, my daughter. She hugged me tightly, careful not to crush Thomas between us. What happened? Why are you here at this hour? Then, looking beyond me to the empty street. Where's Richard? Richard isn't with me, Mom, I replied, my voice breaking. I fled. I fled with Thomas in the middle of the night. Her eyes widened, but not with surprise, with understanding. She already knew, deep down, since her visit to Springfield, that this day would come. Come in. Let's talk inside. In the small kitchen of the house, while Thomas slept peacefully in an improvised crib, my younger sibling's old toy box, I told everything to my mother: the recent violence, the discovery of the safe, the help from Mrs. Quinn and Oliver, the precipitated escape. My mother listened to everything in silence, occasionally drying a tear. When I finished, she held my hands in hers. You did the right thing, my daughter. I know it seems scary now, but you're strong. You always have been, since you were a girl. You'll overcome this and raise your son with dignity. But what if he comes after us, Mom? Richard won't accept that I left him, that I took Thomas, that I took his money. We'll deal with that when it happens. For now, you and the boy need to rest. Then, we'll think about what to do. Those first days in my mother's house were of constant vigilance. With each knock on the gate, each car that passed more slowly down the street, my heart would race. I rarely left the house, and when I did, it was always accompanied by my mother or my brother Robert, who now was 18 and worked in an auto repair shop. 2 weeks passed without any sign of Richard. I was beginning to believe that perhaps he had given up, that perhaps he was relieved to be rid of a wife and son he considered more of a burden than a family. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, he appeared. We were all gathered for lunch, my mother, me, Thomas, Robert, and my younger siblings. The food was all ready on the table when we heard a strong knock on the gate, followed by the voice I knew so well. Eleanor, I know you're in there. Open this gate now. I froze. I looked at my mother, in panic. She got up calmly, drying her hands on her apron. Stay here with the boy. Robert, come with me. Through the window, I saw my mother and Robert approach the gate. Richard was on the other side, with his face red with anger, his hands gripping the iron bars. Where's my wife? Where's my son? She stole my money and fled like a thief. My mother, that small woman who had always seemed so fragile in my eyes, stood before him like a fortress. Your wife and your son are safe, Richard, and that's how they're going to stay. Don't come at me with that, Mrs. Miller, she's my wife. I have the right to take her home, and that money was mine. Robert stepped forward, his fists clenched. Even being younger, he was taller than Richard, with muscles developed from heavy work in the repair shop. You're not taking anyone from here, he said with a firm voice. My sister and my nephew are under our protection now. Richard laughed, a bitter laugh. Protection? You think you can protect her from me? I'm her husband. I have the law on my side. That's when my mother, with surprising calm, said the words that would change everything. You have the law on your side, Richard? Then why don't we go to the police station right now? I'm sure the sheriff will be very interested in the marks on my daughter's wrists, in the bruises on her back. And he'll be even more interested in knowing how you left your wife bleeding in bed during childbirth, while you read the newspaper. Richard's face paled. His expression changed from anger to something more calculating. Don't be ridiculous, Mrs. Miller. Who's going to believe that story? I'm a respected businessman. Eleanor is just a hysterical woman who couldn't handle the responsibility of being a mother. That's when I heard Thomas's cry coming from inside the house. Without thinking, I ran to attend to him, appearing at the door with him in my arms. Richard's eyes fixed on me, and for a terrible moment, I thought he was going to knock down the gate. Eleanor, he said, his voice suddenly softer, trying to sound reasonable. Let's talk. I know things haven't been easy, but we can resolve this. Come home with me, please. I felt my legs tremble, but I found strength where I didn't know it existed. I'm not going back, Richard. Never again. His face contorted again in fury. You don't have a choice. You're my wife. That's my son. A father who abandons his own son during birth doesn't deserve to be called a father, I replied, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. This isn't over, Eleanor, he threatened, pointing his finger. I'm going to recover what's mine. Wait and see. And with that, he turned his back and left with large steps, entering his car parked on the corner. When he left, my legs finally gave way. Robert ran to support me before I fell. He'll be back, Mom, I murmured as I was taken inside. He won't give up. Then we'll be ready, my mother replied with a determination I had never seen before. No one is going to hurt you or Thomas again. No one. That same afternoon, my mother called an acquaintance, Mr. Gerald, who was a clerk at the neighborhood police station. He came to our house, heard my story, saw the bruises that still marked my body. He explained that, legally, Richard had rights as my husband and Thomas's father, but that I could seek protection if I proved the abuse. It's going to be difficult, Mrs. Phillips, he explained honestly. The justice system doesn't usually interfere in family matters, but we can try. In the following days, with Mr. Gerald's help, I filed a formal complaint against Richard. I went to the police station, showed the marks of violence, told about the birth, about the isolation, about the financial control. The sheriff, a middle-aged man named Joe, listened to everything with an impassive expression. Mrs. Phillips, he finally said, I understand your situation, but I must warn you that your husband has already been here. He filed a complaint against you for theft and abandonment of the home. He says you took his money and left home without justification. My heart sank. And what does that mean? It means we have two contradictory versions, his word against yours. And in this country, Mrs. Phillips, the word of a man, especially a respected businessman, usually carries more weight. I left the police station devastated. It seemed that Richard really did have the law on his side, that there was no escape, that eventually I would have to return to him, give him my son, submit myself again to that life of fear and humiliation. That's when the unexpected happened. Upon arriving home, I found my mother talking to a woman I had never seen before. She was an elegant lady, about 50 years old, dressed simply but distinctly. Eleanor, said my mother, this is Mrs. Helen. She was married to Richard before you. I was speechless. Richard had told me he had never been married, that I was his first and only love. Another lie. Mrs. Helen smiled gently. Sit down, my dear. We have a lot to talk about. During the next 2 hours, I heard a story that seemed like a distorted reflection of my own. Helen had married Richard in 1965 in Indianapolis. Just like me, she had been attracted by his distinguished appearance, his educated manners, his promises of a comfortable life. And just like me, she soon discovered the reality behind the facade. He isolated me from my family, controlled every penny, constantly humiliated me, she recounted. When I got pregnant, I thought things would improve. But they got worse. He wasn't interested in the baby, complained about the expenses, about my appearance, and then came the night I'll never forget. Helen also had a difficult birth. She was also neglected by Richard at the most critical moment. The difference is that her baby, a boy, didn't survive. After that, life became unbearable. He blamed me for the baby's death, said I wasn't a real woman, that I was useless as a wife and as a mother. One day, after a particularly violent beating, I fled to my aunt's house in St. Louis. I got a divorce after much struggle, but he never really left me in peace. From time to time, he appears to threaten me, to demand things. "How did you know about me?" I asked, still trying to process everything I was hearing. I found out through acquaintances in Springfield that he had married again. I was worried about the girl, knowing what he was capable of. But I couldn't discover who you were until recently. When I heard you were in St. Louis, that you had fled, I knew I needed to find you. But how did you find us? Mr. Gerald, the clerk, is my cousin. When you filed the complaint and mentioned Richard, he immediately sought me out. Helen opened her purse and took out a yellowed envelope. "I bring something that can help you. These are records, letters I wrote detailing the abuse, photos of the injuries, testimonies from neighbors who witnessed the violence, even a medical report from the day I lost my baby mentioning Richard's negligence. Alone, your word may not be enough against his, but two women with such similar stories, with documented evidence, this justice cannot ignore." I looked at that woman who had gone through the same hell as me, who had survived, who now extended her hand to help me, and I felt a wave of gratitude and hope wash over me. "Why are you doing this for me?" I asked with tears in my eyes. She took my hands in hers, just as my mother had done on the day of my arrival. "Because no one did this for me when I needed it. And because men like Richard only continue to do what they do because their victims remain isolated, silenced. Together, we can break this cycle." The next day, we returned to the police station. This time, I wasn't alone. I was accompanied by my mother, by Mr. Gerald, and by Helen, carrying her envelope of evidence. Sheriff Joe received us with reluctance, clearly bothered that we had returned. When Helen began to speak, I saw his expression gradually change. When she opened the envelope and spread its contents on the desk, the photos, the letters, the medical reports, I saw something that seemed to be respect appear in his eyes. "I'm seeing a pattern here," he finally said. "A very disturbing pattern." In the following weeks, the case took a new turn. Sheriff Joe, convinced by the evidence, filed Richard's complaint against me and opened an inquiry to investigate the accusations of domestic violence. Other witnesses were called. Mrs. Quinn came from Springfield especially to testify, as did Dr. Harold, who confirmed the critical state in which I arrived at the hospital after the birth and mentioned Richard's disdainful comments at the time. When Richard was called to testify, he appeared with an expensive lawyer, confident that he would be able to reverse the situation. But faced with the accumulated evidence, the witnesses, the two testimonies so similar, mine and Helen's, his arrogance began to crumble. The case never reached a formal trial. Richard's lawyer, realizing the fragility of the client's position, proposed an agreement. Richard would agree not to seek me anymore, not to try to see Thomas, not to make more complaints against me, if I, in exchange, would drop the criminal charges. I would also renounce any right to the assets we had in common, basically the house in Springfield. It was a difficult decision. Part of me wanted to see Richard pay for everything he had done, wanted complete justice. But another part, the practical part, knew that a judicial process could drag on for years, that it would be emotionally draining, that it would keep Richard in my life for much longer. After much reflection, many conversations with my mother and with Helen, I accepted the agreement. We signed the papers in a law office in downtown St. Louis. Richard didn't look me in the eyes even once during the entire procedure. When everything was concluded, he stood up to leave. At the door, he turned briefly. "I hope you're satisfied, Eleanor. You destroyed my reputation, took my son from me." For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel fear when facing him. "You did this to yourself, Richard. And Thomas deserves a better father." He left without responding, and I never saw him again. The following weeks were of reconstruction. With the money I had brought from the safe, I rented a small apartment near my mother's house. I started looking for work, but it wasn't easy for a separated woman with a small baby. It was Helen who offered me an opportunity, inviting me to work in the small sewing supply store she managed. "Your mother told me you have talent with needle and thread," she explained, "and I need someone I can trust." Thus began a new phase of my life. I worked at the store during the day, with Thomas usually nearby in an improvised playpen. At night, I did sewing and embroidery work to supplement the income. It wasn't a luxurious life, but it was a life in peace, without fear, without humiliations, without the constant shadow of Richard. Helen became more than a boss. She became a mentor, a friend, almost a second mother. She never had other children after the tragedy with Richard, and she adopted Thomas as the grandson she never had. She taught me not just about the sewing business, but about independence, about dignity, about rebuilding life after trauma. "What he did to you was terrible," she would say, "but don't let that define who you are. You are more, much more than Richard's ex-wife, much more than a victim." And with time, I began to believe this. The frightened young woman who fled from Springfield on a March night gradually gave way to a stronger, more secure, more complete woman. The fear began to dissipate, the emotional wounds began to heal, and the future that once seemed so uncertain began to take shape before me. Thomas grew healthy and happy, surrounded by the love of family. My mother, my siblings, Helen, all contributed to creating a safe and welcoming environment for him. Sometimes I would catch myself observing him while he slept, amazed at how something so pure and innocent could have emerged from such a toxic relationship. He was my greatest joy, my reason to move forward. The years passed, Helen's store prospered, and eventually I became a partner. Thomas started school, a bright and curious boy. In 1979, 7 years after leaving Springfield, I received the news that Richard had died in a car accident, returning from a business trip. I felt a strange mixture of emotions, not joy, certainly not sadness, perhaps just a final relief, the certainty that he could never threaten us again. It was at this moment that I began to think about returning to Springfield, not because of Richard, but because, despite everything, I still considered the small town as a home in some way. I wanted Thomas to know his roots, wanted to see Mrs. Quinn again, wanted to show myself that I could face the ghosts of the past. The decision wasn't easy, and it would take a few more years to materialize it. But the seed was planted. One day, I would return to Springfield, not as Richard's frightened wife, but as a woman in control of her own destiny, with my son by my side, ready to write a new chapter of our story. Today, at my 73 years, I live a peaceful life here in Maplewood, Missouri. Who would have thought that one day I would return to this area that was the scene of so much suffering? But life has these things, my dears. Sometimes we need to make peace with the past to move forward with lightness in our hearts. I returned to the Springfield area in 1985 when Thomas was 13 years old. It was a difficult decision, but necessary. After Richard passed away, I discovered that the house where we lived was still in my name, part of the agreement we made in the separation. Over time, the anger and fear gave way to a certain nostalgia for the small town, for the calmer rhythm of life. St. Louis was getting too big, too noisy for my taste. Helen was instrumental in this decision. "Eleanor," she told me, "that town doesn't belong to Richard. It's yours too, if you want it. Going back isn't a sign of weakness, but of strength, showing that you've overcome." And that's what we did. We sold our participation in the sewing store in St. Louis and opened a branch in Maplewood, just outside of St. Louis. The Floral Atelier, as we called it, became a reference in the area for fine embroidery and trousseau. Thomas grew up helping with the accounts and administration of the business, always with a good head for numbers. When Helen passed away in 1992, it was an immense loss. She who had been so important in my life, who taught me so much about starting over, about being independent. I continued with the atelier alone, keeping her legacy alive in the embroidery I created. Thomas graduated in accounting from St. Louis University, coming and going every week to study. Then he opened his own office here in Maplewood, married Emily, the same one who now helps me with this internet thing, and gave me 2 wonderful grandchildren, Michael, 25, who has already graduated in engineering, and Sarah, 18, who has just entered medical school. My day-to-day now is simple and rewarding. I wake up early, as I've always done. I take care of my plants on the porch. I have a veritable hanging garden that's the envy of the neighborhood. I still embroider a little, even though my eyesight isn't what it used to be. Some old clients still seek me out for special pieces, the kind that no one else knows how to make anymore. On Wednesdays, I meet with a group of ladies at the church for the Hands That Welcome project, where we make baby clothes for expecting mothers in need. It's work that touches my heart, especially thinking about how important it would have been to have this kind of support when I had Thomas. On weekends, the house is full. Thomas and family come to have lunch with me. I always make hearty food, including my famous apple pie with cinnamon that's a tradition here in Missouri, and the peach cobbler recipe I learned from Mrs. Quinn, may she rest in peace. I must mention that I found Mrs. Quinn when I returned to the Springfield area. We became even closer friends, and until her passing in 2001, not a week went by without us having coffee together. I have my little aches and pains, of course. Who reaches my age without them? My knee complains when it's going to rain. My blood pressure sometimes insists on rising, but nothing that prevents me from living my life independently. I still do my own shopping, go to church on Sundays, visit friends. The most beautiful thing about growing old, my dears, is looking back and seeing how much ground has been covered. That frightened girl from Kentucky, who went through so many trials, would never have imagined being here today, surrounded by love, secure, at peace with herself. The scars are still there, some visible, like the one from surgery after childbirth, others invisible, kept in the soul. But they don't hurt like before. They're marks of a battle that I won. And when I look into my grandchildren's eyes, I see that every tear shed, every sleepless night, every moment of fear and uncertainty was worth it. Because they are fruits of a tree that was almost uprooted, but found strength to rise again and blossom once more. My dears, anyone who has experienced a situation of abuse, whatever kind, knows that the deepest wound isn't always physical. It's the one that remains in the soul, that makes us doubt our worth, our ability to move forward. But I'm here, with my wrinkles and my white hair, to tell you that it's possible to start over, it's possible to heal, it's possible to find joy again. I learned that age doesn't define our strength, but rather our ability to begin anew each day. My wrinkles are maps of survival. Each one tells a story of pain overcome. Life taught me that even in the deepest darkness, our inner light never goes out. If you're living in a relationship where you're mistreated, ignored, where your needs are always the last to be considered or aren't considered at all, know that this isn't love. Love is respect. It's care, it's wanting the other's well-being as much as your own. I never allowed my dignity to be stolen, even when they tried to take everything from me. I discovered that we are stronger than we imagine, especially when we think we can't take any more. If you know a woman who is suffering as I suffered, extend your hand. Sometimes all we need is to know that we aren't alone, that there is a way out of that suffering. Mrs. Quinn and Helen were angels in my life. They appeared when I needed help the most. Perhaps you can be that angel for someone. No matter where you are in the world, know that there are people and organizations ready to help. Seek information about protection in your region. Dignity and respect are universal values, no matter where you are. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it teaches us to live with them and still smile. My story isn't about what they did to me, but about how I chose to respond. I learned that true strength isn't in never falling, but in getting up every time. And you who are watching me now, please, don't wait another minute to seek help if you're in an abusive situation. Don't wait until you reach your limit, as I did on that terrible night of childbirth. Don't wait until you almost lose your life. You deserve to live with dignity, with respect, with true love. Share this video with whoever you think needs to hear this message. It may be that your words can't reach someone, but perhaps mine, from an elderly lady who has lived a lot and seen a lot, can touch a heart closed by fear. If this account touched your heart, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. Each subscription gives me strength to continue sharing my story, to continue being a voice for those who haven't yet found theirs. And if you're facing a situation similar to what I lived through, tell me in the comments. This community is a safe space where we can support each other. Share your story, share your pain, but also share your hope. Because as long as there's hope, there's a path ahead. Don't leave it for tomorrow. If you're suffering, seek help now. If you know someone who's suffering, extend your hand immediately. Don't wait for the situation to worsen. Don't wait for one more chance that never comes. Life is too precious to be lived in fear. Because, my dears, what I never told anyone until today is that on that night, while I was bleeding almost to death, I made a promise to God. If He allowed me to live to raise my son, I would use my voice to help other women not go through what I went through. And it's that promise that I fulfill here every week with you.